welcome and thank you everyone for joining in. Senate House is very proud to house Jonathan Catbill's Haud Nominandum collection. In very recent news as well, the National Lottery have allocated funding to our library for the cataloguing of this collection. Jonathan Catbill, for those who don't know, was a queer rights activist and one of the founders of Gaze the Word bookshop here in Bloomsbury. Upon his death in 2019, he left a collection of some 30,000 items to Senate House. And these items include books that were seized from Gaze the Word during the 1984 customs raid, of which we'll talk about more in the session. The books were seized for their queer content and later became the object of the Seized Books exhibition here at Senate House. And these books included Gordon Merrick's late novels, which are the topic of today's session. And I will now introduce our academic speaker, Professor Michael Bronski. Michael has been active in gay liberation as a political organizer, writer, publisher, and theorist since 1969. He's the author of numerous award-winning books, including You Can Tell by Looking and 20 Other Myths About LGBT Life and People, and Considering Hate, Violence, Goodness, and Justice in American Culture and Politics, co-authored with Kate Whitlock, and A Queer History of the United States, which is being reissued in a revised 15th anniversary edition in May 2026. And in 2017, Michael was awarded the Bill Whitehead Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Publishing Triangle. And he is currently Professor of the Practice in Activism and Media in the Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining in.
All right. Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Lila, very much. I have to say, I always feel so old after those introductions.
No, you're not. You're wise. Yes, before we start the actual oh, sorry, I forgot to change the slide. Before we start the actual session, Michael and I have talked about these novels, Gordon Merrick's Pulp novels, at length now, and we realize that there is a very different experience in reading them in the 2020s and reading them when they were originally published in the 1970s. So I was wondering, Michael, if you wanted to say something about that, as someone who read the novels when they were being published.
Sorry to pipe in before you start, Michael. I can't see the slides. Can you try resharing them again, Andrea, before we start? Sorry, folks.
Let me try again.
Oh, other people could see the slides. So, oh, okay.
Can you see them now?
Yes, I can now. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Excellent.
Great.
So yes, Michael.
Right. So, Lord Won't Mind is 1970, I believe. So I'm actually 21 at the time. I've actually been out for several years. I've actually been writing book reviews. I actually was pursuing reading queer novels since I was a young teen. So, I think for me and people my age, right, what was surprising about Lord Won't Mind and the novels that followed, that you didn't have to seek them out. You didn't have to find a list of titles that might be gay, right? Or you didn't have to follow everything that James Baldwin or Mary Renault wrote, right? So most of the people in that I knew, right, were sort of readers, and we really valued those older books, right? Whether it be Bridget Brophy's, some of Bridget Brophy's novels, or whether it be Mary Renault, or whether it be James Baldwin or Tennessee Williams plays, right? So what was those are all great literature. I'm not going to quite make the case for Gordon Merrick. What was surprising about Gordon Merrick, right, in Lord Won't Mind, was that you didn't have to seek it out. It was on the front page of not the front page of the New York Times. It was reviewed in the New York Times. It was prominently displayed in bookstores. It was from a major New York publisher, and they did not try to say that it was not coded in any way. So the antecedent for that, a little bit, right, is 63, 64 with John Ritchie's City of Night. But what the Gordon Merrick novels did was that they actually, City of Night was a bestseller, was underground literature, was avant-garde in many ways, was really about men who were hustling, men who were sex workers, right? The Gordon Merrick novels were all about upper class men who were very beautiful. It wasn't seedy, it wasn't underground. And it was easily accessible, right? You could actually, in fact, I wrote, I couldn't find it in my files, but I actually wrote a book review of it for my town paper for the Scotch Plains Times. So I don't think anybody I knew thought they were good, but we all knew that they were sort of important in a way because they were actually bringing visibility, you know, historically, right, a year after the Stonewall uprisings.
Yeah, and it's true that they're important, and I think the content, because I don't know if everyone in this session is aware that the contents of these novels are extremely pulpy. There is so much explicit gay sex happening, and we talked about the reaction of someone in the 1970s reading it, and someone in 2025, which was when I read them for the very first time, and I thought it was too much almost, and you even said once you've read one, you've read them all. So I was wondering maybe if um, you can talk a bit about these sort of hyper masculine idealized men, whose bodies are constantly being compared, measured, eroticized, and what it meant to read something like that in the 1980s, the 70s and 80s.
Sure. I mean, clearly on one, not on one level, on the main level, they're fantasies, right? They're like, I mean, Bridget Brophy has a wonderful line in her book on Ronald Furbank, Prancing Novelist, right, where she says that all fiction is a masturbatory fantasy, and clearly, these books are masturbatory fantasies. Right, very, very different than Giovanni's Room or Another Country or other works that included homoerotic content during the time, right? I mean, it's also interesting, right, that at this point, at least in America, right, the censorship laws had pretty much been thrown out completely. So it was pretty easy if you lived in an urban center or even could get into the mail to buy gay male pornography, right, which was actually more explicit than The Lord Would Mind, but much less explicit than Giovanni's Room, or even less explicit than City of Night by John Rechy. So I think that, all this takes place in the early, the books are set in various other places, but for the urban gay man, or not even the urban gay man, for the American gay man, that what we were seeing here is that a year after Stonewall, there was much more discussion about homosexuality. Images were rising to the top of the media list of what you could actually put in newspapers. So even a very, very respectable magazine that everybody in America read, like literally was on every living room coffee table, Life magazine by 72 actually is printing pictures of gay men in drag or gay men dressed in leather, right? So this really plays into a larger explosion, not only of gay male romance, but of gay male sexuality. And I think the genius of these books is the marketing of them, and the fact that they actually wedded explicit gay male sexuality, like who put what into who, with extravagant emotional scenarios. Very, very much like what we would think about as sort of like described. I believe it was the Dorothy Parker in the 30s or 40s talked about all those novels by lady novelists with three names, like Mary Roberts Reinhardt or Adele Rogers St. John. Exuberant emotional stories, only now mixed with a lot of gay male bonking.
Yeah, and just before I move on, just a note for those who joined just now, the session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please switch your cameras off. Michael, thank you very much. I was wondering, because you used the word marketing, and we'll get back to it in a second, but we talked, and you talked a lot about the importance of the publishing history of these novels.
Yeah.
Now, the copies we have in the collections here at Senate House are Avon editions, but you mentioned you know a lot about the Guys publishing house as well, which published them in the US, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. They were published. So I'm just trying to say, looking at this cover now, my late friend John Mitzel, who ran Glad Day Bookstore and Callus Bookstore in Boston, both queer bookstores, would always say, you know, the first thing that has to happen for somebody to buy a book is that they have to pick it up because of the cover. Clearly, people would pick up this cover, or this cover, or that cover. Right. So Bernard Geis, I think it's Geis or Geis, I'm not sure. Began in the 50s or the 60s, the late 50s, I believe, as a reputable publisher. He had backing from people like Art Linkletter, who was, nobody would know his name anymore, but very, very famous TV personality. Some other people. He had investments from Time magazine, I believe. His first big hit was the early 60s with a book that was considered a huge bestseller called Sex and the Single Girl by Helen Gurley Brown. That was a guide for the single girl. And essentially it was a guide for the single girl to get ahead and get married, no matter who she was sleeping with, usually the boss, and to be an independent woman. And the end of it might be to get married, but she had a lot of fun along the way. It was condemned by church leaders and people. It was sort of shocking. It was a huge bestseller. Later on in the 60s, he published a book that people will probably know the name of Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Suzanne, about three actresses in New York who get addicted to pills called dolls. Right. So he really evolved or devolved into sort of a sensationalist publisher, and came across this and published it in 70, I guess. And it fell into, you know, he actually had hits because he heavily marketed books. He put huge amounts of money into just getting the book out there, and it worked. Right. After he did The Lord Would Mind, he did another book called The King about Frank Sinatra that he was almost sued for, and one called The Exhibitionist, essentially about Jane Fonda, that he was almost sued for. They were Romana Clefts. Right. So his genius was really not in choosing great literature, but in actually marketing really popular literature. And there's a great worth in popular literature because it's popular.
Yeah. And when oops, sorry.
Oh, no, and I'm going to say, this is happening around the same time that mainstream publishers, I'm thinking of Martin's Press in New York, a large press, Avon later, because Avon does these paperbacks, but there are people that are actually beginning to consider publishing more overtly queer books. Michael Dennedy certainly was in the forefront of that. So this is a really link between the old-fashioned sort of exploitation and a newer emergence of, say, like Ed White and people of like literature, of queer literature.
Yeah. And when, if we look at these paperbacks, they are, the question is this pure marketing? Does it remind, having read these novels now, there isn't much about the novel itself. It's more about these bodies that are, full of libido, masculinity. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk about what Merrick calls the masculine love. This is what he called it's this feeling love, these relationships, these relationships that happen between these hyper masculine men with ideal bodies. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to the covers, and especially in relation to the gay male gaze. Is it just exaggeration, or is it a parody?
Sure.
Is it reinforcing that stereotype, or is it a parody via exaggeration?
Yes, and I think you're completely right. I think it's actually both of those things. And I think that the roots of it, I'll try to do this really quickly, right? The roots of it we actually see the idealized, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think. We have to see the idealized male body in the novels of Mary Renault. We see them certainly in the writings of John Addington Symonds in the late Victorian, in the reclamation of the beauty of same-sex male love in ancient Greek statues. And no surprise that we'll go into it later, these novels are actually set in various Greek locations at times, right? So it's sort of Hellenic exaltation of the gay male body. But also, I think what's interesting about these covers, to be clear, come out a little, the book is 1970, these covers are a little bit later. But these covers really are, really play back into the notion of the classical male form in ancient Greek culture, which, of course, the late Victorians, the early 20th century homosexual apologists always valued, because it showed that like love between men was a pure thing. Certainly Oscar Wilde talks about this, right? But it's all, these covers are also advertising art. I mean, they're not just book cover art to get by the book, right? But they really fit into, these with a few more accessories, they could be added for an upscale clothing store in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, right? So it really is the marketing, not only of the book, but a marketing of a new sort of homosexual for the mid 70s and even going to the early 80s, like the post Stonewall, pre-AIDS, because don't forget, AIDS begins in 1981. The first cases are actually reported, right? So this is in this window of a decade, right, of this sort of glorification of a gay male body, which becomes a parody of the gay male body pretty quickly and can coexist, right? So if I was talking to a student years ago, and we were looking at, he was doing a senior thesis on gay male iconography, and he said he had pictures from the 70s of men in bars. And he said, why were men called clones? And I said, well, because they were clones. They literally looked, that in fact, the repetition of the image reinforced the power of the image and reinforced the image as parody, because in fact, clones were both parodies and authentically sexy. Now, these men aren't quite clones. They're more sort of upscale, rich guys at a circuit party clones.
Yeah. And this is extremely interesting. And if, we move on to considering these novels and queer pulp as a genre, and you've written extensively about it, what, would you say that Merrick's work aligns? Does it diverge from the sort of politics of pleasure of, I'm not going to say traditional queer pulp, but the sort of maybe post-World War II pulp? And then obviously here we have also a comparison of the hardback and the paperback of edition of One for the Gods. So that is interesting to consider how the hardback is more tame.
Yeah, so I mean, I think these covers are really interesting, right? Because on my left, I think it's on everybody's left, for one for the Gods, which is the cloth edition. Later books came out as paperback originals, but Lord Won't Mind and One for the Gods, and I believe the next book came out as cloth. It's almost identical to some of the covers of the early Mary Renault novels set in ancient Greece, which actually, if people don't know, were profoundly homoerotic in their content. The Persian Boy and other novels. So it clearly, people, like all advertising, it copies itself. If something works, it gets copied and reproduced again, right? It's sort of the simulacra. It's a copy without an original. It keeps on getting copied and morphing. But I thought that what was really interesting, and Andres mentioned the pulps, right? That if we actually, and we'll talk about this in a minute, right? Looking at the history of the gay male pulp novel in the 50s, which were paperback copies and covers of literary works that had come out in hardcover. But if we look at the cover for one for the Gods, it's almost, it's a complete copy of a cover from a novel by Charles Jackson, which, by the way, is a great novel from 1947 or 48, I think, of a man who actually a professor who actually falls in love with a married professor. And in the Gordon Merrick, right, we actually see the triangle, the two men in love with the wife watching or the woman watching. In the original version of this, the Fall of Valor, right, the men are in the woman is foreground and the men are in the background. In the Gordon Merrick version, the men, and obviously their butts are very much right in the front of the novel, and the woman is actually in the background. And interestingly, both are set in coastal things because in both we can see the ocean behind them there. So in a way, the marketing of it is that the Gordon Merrick novels really depended to some degree on, I think, on an older crowd of readers. I don't think I was more unusual at that age of reading them because most of my contemporaries were reading newer things coming out from the small gay presses, but older gay men I knew were reading Gordon Merrick, right? So they would have had some understanding of these earlier queer novels coming out during the 50s. So I think there's no way that the design of One for the Gods or whoever designed it did not know the cover of A Fall of Valor, since it's almost a complete, with changes, but almost a complete copy of it. And also, right, somewhat unusual to see men on covers during the late 40s, early 50s, or the 50s, in such a with bathing suits in this sort of provocative pose. I mean, there's no question what the novel's about.
And if I may jump on this and ask a question that just about this specific cover, because I'm just realizing that this is probably the only cover of Merrick's work, the only book with a woman on the cover. But then, as we'll see later, women are present in these books. They are not just as side characters, but as, well, yes, side characters, but as sexual objects, unfortunately, because they are objectified. And I wonder, like, what do you think it means? And sorry, this is a completely spontaneous question, but what do you think it means for this specific novel to have a woman on the cover?
Well, I can only speculate. I suspect, and we'll talk about this later, how the readership of these novels were not only gay men, gay men that I knew, and because when the Lord one came out, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for several weeks. The first week, 2 weeks may have been every gay man in the country buying one, but there aren't those many gay men in America to keep it on the bestseller list for 3 or 4 weeks. So clearly the readership was broader, right? And clearly, as we've discovered, and we'll talk about this later, right? Clearly the readership was evolving into being heterosexual women reading it. So I'm wondering whether or not, if we look at the cover, could we go back to this slide just before? That in fact they were understanding that while women were in the novel, it doesn't matter whether they were or weren't for the marketing, right? But that the readership matters, and that if they were understanding that there was a heterosexual female readership, that they decided to put a woman on there for some sort of identification, say this is for you as well.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, this was completely spontaneous. And then if we go back, these are all the covers and the paperbacks we have in the collection, and there's 2 that, as you can see, are kind of like art objects because you open them and the image is landscape, basically. So, I mean, you've already said, but why do you think you already, introduced the next question, which is about women reading these novels. Why do you think there was such a big interest for Merrick, for queer pulp in general? Was it for queer pulp in general? And obviously that continues, as we have seen in recent times. Women, straight, bisexual, queer women, keep being interested in in male queer desire. Why do you think that is? And what do you think they found appealing in Merrick's work, considering that the treatment of women in his work is not exactly respectful, shall we say?
Sure. I think that's a really great, complicated question. Right. I think that for the gay male readership or the gay, to be more accurate, the gay male buyership, right? These are sexy covers. You all get into the store, you want to read something on the train. Of course, you'd pick up something with cute gay men touching one another in loving embraces. Right. I think that there's and even on the one to the far right, like Walter, Clara, Tom, Jerry, and Walter, like it's not really a lot of women. It's just Clara with 3 men. Right. So there's actually a long history, and I'm thinking of America. I'm sure there are plenty of novels in the UK that have the same themes, right? Of sort of women's novels. I'm thinking of Edna Ferber in America, Fannie Hurst, Grace Livingston Hill, other people. They're sort of sob stories, right? It's like, I found the perfect man. He now loves another woman. He's now leaving me. Or Fannie Hurst Backstreet, she's in love with a wonderful businessman, and she spends her entire life following him around, and he's unobtainable, although they have an affair, right? That I think that there's a female readership that was very attached to those novels, and these are actually the same plot. It's even though the women in these novels are actually treated quite badly often and described in pretty terrible language, right? It sort of mirrors bad heterosexual relationships, and it actually replaces it with bad bisexual relationships with really, really cute men who are not going to be violent, who are not going to be really thuggish or terrible, but who are actually leaving the main woman for another person, this time a man, right? Or involved in a loving relationship with another man in which she becomes superfluous, which is the same plot as the, I'm in love with a married man, but he can't leave his wife. Story from the 30s, made famous by Fannie Hurst in Backstreet and other novels.
Just to conclude this first half of the session, I was wondering if you wanted to maybe talk a bit more about the role of Gordon, like the position, the role, the importance of Merrick in pulp marketplace. We have here a number of pulp covers. We have Giovanni's Room, The City and the Pillar, again the Finisterre. How do you? Because obviously this is late pulp, I would say, late queer pulp.
Yes. So it's interesting, right, that these novels, and I've written a book called Pulp Friction, which is an analysis and an anthology of many of these books. So there's actually, I'm of the Stonewall generation, right? There was always this myth about, there was nothing queer before Stonewall. Stonewall changed everything. Stonewall was the breaking point culturally that brought on all this literature and all this poetry. The reality was that there was a huge body of literature, all post-war literature, and it's important to realize that Gordon Merrick got his start writing 3 novels in 1945, 40, 46, 47, 49, I think, that are actually not bad novels. But there was a huge body of works of, I don't want to call it homoerotic, but works that predominantly featured homosexual themes in the post-war era, in the late 40s and to 52 or 53, that came out. That was literary works, and all of these novels here are all very literary. They were published in cloth by established New York publishers, except for Finisterre, which was actually published by a not quite established New York publisher, but the other ones are all Charles Jackson, Fall of Valor. His first novel won a National Book Award about the title escapes me, about an alcoholic made into a famous movie with Ray Milland, right? And when the paperbacks came out, they were marketed in what we now think of as pulp, right? Right. If you look at the titles here, a powerful novel of a tragic love, a powerful novel of a heartbreaking love, powerful novel. They're all powerful novels. A masterful novel of a personal tragedy. The Night Air is a homosexual, looks at himself. Giovanni's Dream is a daring novel, right? What's interesting is that even though some of these novels end tragically, they're really exposés of homophobia, right? And actually, The Night Air doesn't end tragically. The other ones do for various reasons. So there is this long. I mean, when I was researching Pulp Fiction, I was shocked. I came across a review by Diana Trilling, who was a prominent, married to Lionel Trilling, the critic, who was a prominent literary arbitrator and journalist, right? And she begins her review of, I think, of The Bitterweed Path by saying, "Yet another novel about homosexuals." So there are so many of them, right? And all of these became essentially, the phrase I would use, that the covers became refrigerator magnets as campy, pulpy junk. And each of these novels is really good, actually. I mean, I would say they're all excellent novels. So, and they really laid the groundwork for what Gordon Merrick and also some post-Stonewall writers would actually draw upon. Right. And I can't help but sort of emphasize, right, that in fact, they do all end in some tragedy, but in fact, they're really good novels and they're exposés of homophobia. And they all, except for Giovanni's Room, they all feature on the cover women or some sort of heterosexual situation, I think both for marketing and to highlight how tragic the homosexual was, even though in the book he isn't.
That's very interesting. Yes,
You
and
can even see, if you look at Finisterre City and The Pillar and The Night Air, the men, it's interesting just graphically, the men all have the same expression.
yeah, what I was going to say, yes. Especially The Night Air and Finisterre, it's almost the same man standing there.
Yes. And of course, it's interesting when you look at Finisterre, right? It's about a young boy whose parents getting divorced and who falls in love with a man. He's a teenager, the other man's in his later 20s. And the young man ends up committing suicide, not because of his affair with the older man, but because his new stepfather is sexually abusing him.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Michael. I think someone's mic is on. If they could switch it off, please. Thank you. And Michael, I am just aware of time, so
yes,
shall we? Can I?
Well, I hate to shut up at any point.
No, I don't want to tell you to shut up, but I might have to just move on to the next question, which is more about the colonial gaze. So we're moving from critique to critique of Merrick's work. And I suppose my first question would be to just maybe give us a sense of, how Merrick uses foreign setting, all these colonial escapes as queer fantasy spaces, because obviously today we criticize it, but how was it perceived at the time, and what does it mean for these air quotes exoticized and eroticized places such as Southeast Asia, Italy, France? What does it mean to become a space of queer fantasy for an American man, a veteran as well?
Yes. So I think that's a great question. I think it's really at the heart of both of how he's imagining the possibility of same-sex love in material circumstances, right? But also how the American population is thinking of it as well in terms of marketing the novels, right? So clearly, right, going back to Oscar Wilde and Gide and other people have always, if we think of, the part of what Edward Said would call Orientalism, which we all call Orientalism now, although I believe he's one of the first to use the term public, in a broad way, right, was that non-white cultures, non-puritanical cultures are more free. So clearly we see this in, Oscar Wilde and Bosie going to Morocco and going to places, and Gide going to other places. Later, Paul Bowles and other writers, including Tennessee Williams, going to particularly Morocco and not so much the Far East, but the sort of Northern African countries. Right. And I think, even though America is in great flux at the time, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War, which ends in 75. We've had civil rights movements. We've had gay liberation. We've had radical feminism. The country's changing, right? And I think that, a country in tremendous flux is a great background for many novels. And certainly many novels, novels by Norman Mailer or other people came out of that. Gore Vidal's other novels came out of that, right? I think that a nation in turmoil and it being ripped apart in so many ways, right, is not a good setting for romantic love between two men. So what do? You actually pluck them out of cities being burned down by racial uprisings, women demanding their rights, homosexuals having angry marches in the street, and you put them into Sri Lanka, you put them into Greece, a favorite, because Greece is, of course, the birthplace not only of like democracy but of gay male love. Right. So I think it makes perfect sense for Merrick to actually move his characters out of America. And that's part and parcel to the fantasy of how this idealized, beautiful, as we see on the cover here, of gay men having perfect freedom.
Yeah. And Michael, can I just add that it might be useful, we've had this conversation before, but to distinguish American and British colonialism, because obviously they're very different. And I think most of our audience is probably more familiar with British British imperialism. But it might be, especially because we're about to talk about the eroticized East.
Right. Yeah. And I would I know we had this discussion a little bit before, but I would actually say that I would be more comfortable using American imperialism, even though it's also colonialist, of course, right, versus traditional British colonialism, which is also imperialism, of course. Right. So I think that America has, America was founded in settler colonialism, and we gradually moved across because of what's called manifest destiny across the entire continent, right? But we were not adverse to finding other places, to Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Cuba for a time, right? To add to our Greenland in the imperial imagination. Canada now, right? So I think that has always been part of America. I think after World War II, when so many rich Americans traveled before World War II. In World War I, we sent a lot of soldiers, but it wasn't as many soldiers as World War II, right? World War II, we sent soldiers across the world, right? To the Far East, we sent them to all over Europe. And it was, the song, the famous song in the 20s about how, we get the title, this is the how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Right. So for the imagination, going to all these countries, and amazingly, so many African American soldiers stayed in Germany and other places and France after the war, because it was not as overtly racist as coming back to Alabama or even New York, right? So the notion of the Far East as a imaginative point of sexual freedom was really strong, and we see this particularly in the late 40s, early 50s, with a series of books. I think we have the next slide coming up, right? A sort of series of really popular novels and then movies, presenting sometimes tragically, sometimes not tragically, love between American soldiers and South Asian women. Right. And it's interesting, this is a novel by Love Is the Main Splendid Thing made into a very popular movie with Jennifer Jones. The woman character is actually a in the novel called Eurasian, I think a term we don't use anymore, and it's written by a Chinese woman, I believe. But it's really telling on the covers, the cover of the novel. We see him pleading with her to stay with him, and in the poster for the movie, he's actually dominating her. It's William Holden, who is famous for his very buff body. Go back to the slide before this. Right. Sayonara is actually by James Mitchell, who actually wrote Tales of the South Pacific, which becomes the musical South Pacific. Right, about a love affair between an American soldier and a Japanese woman. Movies with Marlon Brando. And this ends sadly, if not tragically. Can we go to the third slide? Right, Teos of the Orcas Moon is actually sort of a comedy. Both it begins as a novel and then as a movie again with Marlon Brando again, although not in the romantic role. So America sort of, and there are others as well, but America's the notion. The irony here I want to begin is that where many states still have laws against miscegenation in America, up until Loving v. Virginia, right? America's sort of in the imagination very much fixated on affairs between American men and South Asian women, and in many ways this is Merrick's actually continuing this or playing on it or extending it or using it. And indeed many men did in fact marry women when they were in Japan or in Korea and other places, right? And of course this leads us in the 60s and beyond into Vietnam and the war against Vietnam.
And it was interesting what you again told me when we talked about this, about how actually all of this is only and is just a device to enhance the masculinity of the American character.
Completely, yes.
But so, for instance, can I maybe, if I go back to this Perfect Freedom, where there is this, I don't know if you remember the plot, as we said before, you've read one, you've read them all, but in this one specifically, there is this Italian man who is seen as the most masculine man ever, who becomes friends with, I can't remember the name of the American boy, and then the boy gradually becomes more and more masculine, macho, if you will, by imposing his masculinity over Rico, I think is the Italian guy.
Right. And again, that's interesting because that in some way is like replicating the Greek concept of pederasty. Nothing to do with Mr. Epstein at all. Right. And the notion of a younger man being nurtured and brought into manhood by the older man, and of course Greek pederasty to a large degree depended on the subjugation of women and slaves in the broader context.
I'm sorry, Michael, I'm gonna move on just because I am aware that we are running a bit behind. But I wanted to bring back the conversation on the question of the great gay American novel. So I was gonna, we read Joseph Ortiz's book on Gordon Merrick, in which Ortiz argues that Merrick invented the great gay American novel. So I wanted to ask you if, first of all, do you agree with this claim, and if yes or not, what criteria do you think we use to evaluate the great gay American novel? Is it because of literary merit? Is it the cultural impact, the eroticism, the political defiance?
Yeah, that's a great question, I think.
Yeah.
So
have you read? Is it nice?
I think there's some.
You don't check at all.
We seem to have other people.
You want me to write?
There's a microphone on.
Because it seems that you.
Yes. So I think that the phrase "the great gay American novel" or "the great American novel" is a wonderful phrase for advertising. I mean, I think that I think there is no great American novel. I think there may be really important American novels for any specific period. I mean, if I would to be flippant, I would say that the great American novel is actually Moby Dick, because it has men and it has love, it has adventure, it has whales. Everybody ends up happily at the end, kind of, except including the whale. Right. You know, I think the Merrick novels were very important novels for the time for a number of reasons. One of which, and I think it's important to say that they're not very well written, particularly. They're about as well written as Valley of the Dolls, which is not as well written as, you know, Gone with the Wind, which is actually a sort of terrible novel, but better written. But, you know, the very nature of popular culture is that it actually fades away, right? And I think that, you know, people still read Gone with the Wind, but almost nobody really reads it compared to seeing the movie, right? I can't think of, you know, I mean, there are great literary works by E.M. Foster or Hemingway or Fitzgerald that last, but, you know, popular fiction doesn't really last. I think what's so impressive about the Merrick novels that they've actually lasted. They've gone through, I think, 3, maybe 4 series of reissues. This is probably the second one. There were several after this. I know Allison Press in Boston published them sometime in the 80s after these editions. So I just would never say the great American novel for anything, and the great American gay novel certainly. I think there are important works of fiction that come out, and nonfiction, but of fiction that come out, that are very meaningful for the time and often fade away. And what's amazing is that these were very important for many people, for like many readers, that they did not fade away. They certainly were important, right, for the customs officials who rated is the word. Because if you look at these book covers, they're pretty clearly sexy American dirty novels.
And I suppose it goes, you know, it goes back to the question of canon, and we have a quote that you generously suggested by Edmund White about the canon. Do you want to read it, or shall I read it and
Why don't you read
let
it?
you Yeah. This is from The Burning Library. I myself am in favor of desacralizing literature, of dismantling the idea of a few essential books, of retiring the whole concept of the canon. The canon is for people who don't like to read, people who want to know the bare minimum of titles they must consume to be considered polished, well-rounded, civilized. Any real reader seeks the names of more and more books, not fewer and fewer.
Yes, and I have to say, I think White is perfectly clear here, and actually, it's a profoundly deserved rebuke to I'm choosing my words carefully, a profoundly well deserved rebuke of very many academic notions of creating the canon, right? I mean, certainly if you're teaching literature courses, you want to pick out novels that are going to resonate for your students and represent the time, you know. But those novels may not always be novels by Dickens. They may be third-rate Victorian novelists that are actually capture the times as well as, if not better than, say, Dickens, right? So not that you shouldn't read Charles Dickens or Charlotte Bronte or, you know, any number of other writers. But I think that to actually think about Gordon Merrick as part of a canon doesn't do him justice as a writer, because it actually removes him from his clearly strong fan base, and doesn't do the notion of the canon any great stuff, because any great credit, because they're not particularly very good novels in terms of literary style. So And I mean, I think a novel can be really important without being very good.
And what about an idea maybe of lineage, of genealogy of queer authors, censored or not? Like, I'm thinking about Wilde, Radcliffe Hall, Genet, or even Mary Reynolds, whom you've mentioned already.
Yeah.
Do you think that this very pulpy erotica belongs in that genealogy, or
Well,
and if it does, where would you locate it, I suppose?
sure. I think it belongs in a genealogy of. So I think we need to make a distinction between novels, and we can all agree to some degree, and this changes, right? That what's well written and what's not well written, versus what's important and what's not important, right? So I think in terms of if we're creating a canon or a list of novels that touched gay male readership, certainly the Merrick novels is in that category, right? If we're looking at novels that actually, fit into some broader agreed upon notion of literary worth, they don't fall into that. And I guess, given the fact that the notions of greater literary worth actually change over time, right? There's a novelist in America people may not have heard of, William Dean Howells, who was up until the 20s and 30s considered a great American novelist and now is sort of unreadable, even though he was very, very popular and really dictated a lot of American culture, right? So even our notions of what's actually great literature changes over time. I mean, don't forget that Moby Dick was ignored when it came out and was only considered a great classic when in the 30s, late 20s and 30s, 40s with Matheson. Yeah. So everything is in flux. So I wouldn't say Gordon Merrick is wrote and sort of invented the great American novel. I would say that we really need to listen to the fan base and to readers and think about what their responses are and why, and what really resonates with them.
And if we do think about responses from the audiences, and this is my last question before moving on to the final section, because I am very much aware that we're running out of time, but I wonder if I'm wondering what again, thinking about the response, what does the policing of queer desire, of representation of queer desire and queer pleasure tell us about Merrick's work and Merrick's popularity, despite being critically dismissed?
Well, I think, I think the world, despite setbacks now and again, I mean, right, shockingly, the Trump administration demanded that the rainbow flag be taken down at the Stonewall Memorial, which they didn't want to get rid of, but it's absurd to think that you take down the rainbow flag. Right. I think that with a couple of setbacks, right, we've seen more and more cultural media sponsored acceptance of gay male relationships, of lesbian relationships in the media, right? I mean, I was watching TV a few nights ago and there were, in a space of a few hours, 3 ads featuring openly gay or coded gay couples, including two of lesbian couples, but with Subarus. Right. So there's an there are two narratives. One is the narrative of like gaining political power or gaining political acceptance, and then gaining media acceptance. And I think certainly that the Merrick novels showed an upswing in the acceptance of gay male imagery and emotions in life and even sexuality. Right, that is not the same as political acceptance. And I think that's still going on today, right? When we actually see, and I know what's coming up next, right? Where we actually see the fevered adulation, right? And we've been seeing in media on like American TV, whether it be Drag Race, whether it be earlier Will and Grace, whether it be gay characters popping up. I mean, even the Disney Channel has gay characters on their shows aimed at 8 to 13-year-olds. So there is a way in which media popular acceptance is quite different than political acceptance.
Yeah. And thank you so much. Just to move on, I need to change the slide. Let's move on to talking about women. You mentioned that the audience, the main buyers, I think you said, the buyership of Merrick's work was women. However, the treatment of women is not excellent, so to speak.
Right.
And there is in Merrick's work an abundance of sex scenes that are saturated with what Merrick calls the masculine love. I think I mentioned this already. It's this fantasy space, lockers where desire overrides realism completely. So I was wondering if we could maybe talk about the gay male gaze and how it differs from the straight male gaze that dominates instead mainstream erotica, and then perhaps maybe connected to the negotiating specters of the trope of the pathetic lonely gay man and the hyper masculine gay, the Grecian masculinity. Sorry, this is a very long question. I'm going to let you speak.
Right. And I'll speak very briefly because I know we're running out of time too. Right. I think that there's and we talked with the pulp covers, right? We've seen this image of the pathetic lonely gay man, and certainly Merrick is trying to counter that completely. Right. And I think that in the context of the 70s, right, and of course with the rise of feminism, both second wave feminism and radical feminism in the later 60s, right? And then broadly feminist changes within the culture, right? That a primary way for gay men to actually prove their love for one another and to prove their masculinity and to prove their dominance, right, is to do it at the expense of women characters. And I think this dovetails very nicely with a long tradition of sort of pulpy women's novelist writings in which the identification for the woman reader is with the strong woman who actually is oppressed, right? So I think we could flip these. We could certainly look at these novels and say, ooh, they're really creepily misogynist, and I think they are. I want to make that clear, but I think there's a way to actually that a feminist reading might be to say, boy, these gay men are really, really horrible. These gay men are no better than straight men. These gay men are actually like scum to women.
And what if I am aware that we are running out of time, but just 5 more minutes. Please indulge me. And you talked about this binary and how it makes women expendable. And there probably is something to say about bisexuality, which is again a central, I would say, element of these plots, but it's often, I suppose, from what you're saying, framed as a tension between social conformity and erotic freedom. And I'm going to take this to the final question, or obviously in Merrick's work, I'm going to call them bisexual sex scenes because there's always the focus is always on the man and on the future relationship with other men. So even if it's the man is having sex with a woman, the man is thinking about either himself or another man.
Right.
So it's obviously a scene of, these are obviously scenes of initiation in the, again, Greek sense. But does it complicate our understanding of sexual identity? And I would also move it to, as I said, the final question: how does it relate to I wrote this down, the cross identificatory pleasures at play? Sorry. Right. So basically, what does it mean when this queer male desire becomes a site of projection for non-queer audiences, or potentially queer audiences, but that are basically the women that are obsessed with Merrick's work, or in contemporary times, heat of rivalry, and I should actually move to the final slide.
Right. Right. I think that's a really complicated question, right? I think that I think to go back to American novels for a second, right? I think it's interesting that the term bisexual, well, to be clear, people have always loved and desired and had sex with whomever they wanted to. That by the notion of opposite sex or many gendered sexuality is not new, of course. The word or the term bisexuality really became popularized in the early 70s. Before that, the term bisexual was actually used for hermaphroditic plants. There are early sexology manuals where bisexual actually means what we'd say heterosexual, because it was bi meaning two across. Right, but there was a phenomenon which was written up in magazines like Time Magazine, Life, called in 72, 73, where that was bisexual chic, where it was chic to be bisexual. Going to Club 47, and like other places. So I think the Merrick novels play on that. I think when we get to heated rivalry, and to your question, right? What does it mean, right, when queer male desire enters into a really far more complex, far more complicated set of negotiations in mainstream media, right? And we know that heated rivalry's audiences is predominantly, I think, studies show, straight women, and the Merrick novels are as well. I don't know. I'm not a heterosexual woman. I can't actually speak to that itself, right? But it is interesting. What interests me, right, is that there's enough energy put into consuming heated rivalry and the Merrick novels, that there is some cultural shift going on, that dovetails with the acceptance of gay imagery, but is really more about heterosexuals negotiating their own imaginations and desires. Maybe because the guys are really cute and the guys are having loving sex, and it's a fantasy that women can relate to, and that women can sometimes be part of, even if they're not predominant in that.
Yeah, thank you for answering this very convoluted question that was really 5 questions in one. And just one last note before we open the Q&A. There's an article on Shadow Mag, if I'm not mistaken, that says that the appeal of a show like Heat of Rivalry is the erotics of equality, the fact that the heterosexual male gaze is removed, and it's liberating to a lot of women who want to be free to fantasize, if that makes sense. But I think we should probably open it up to the Q&A. So thank you so much, Michael. Layla, can we maybe start